I trust you have your Bible with you this evening, and I encourage you to take it and turn to 2 Kings chapter 5. As we mentioned this morning, we'll be taking our text from 2 Kings chapter 5. This is the story of the healing of Naaman, and I want us to make a run through the chapter, and then we're going to come back and look at some things that are found therein. This is in the time of the prophet Elisha, who is mentioned in this context. We're not going to read every verse, but we're going to scan through and get a summary of chapter 5. As the scene opens, verses 1 to 4, there is a man named Naaman, who is a commander of the king's army of Syria. He was a man that was of great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, verse 1, because the Lord had given victory to Syria through this man. And he was a man that was a mighty man of valor. He was a very successful warrior. We'll say more about that in a moment. And yet verse 1 said he was a leper. Verse 2 said, as the Syrians went out to raid, they had captured a girl from the Israelites and made a slave out of her, and she became a servant to Naaman's wife. And she waited upon Naaman's wife. And this girl said to her mistress, if only my master were with the prophet in Samaria. She is talking about Elisha. In other words, if my master could only, if Naaman could only get in touch with the prophet Elisha, the prophet over there in Samaria, that he would heal him of his leprosy. And so Naaman went and told his master, that is the king, the matter, and thus the girl from the land of Israel has said. So the slave girl suggests from Israel that Naaman, who is a Syrian, go find the prophet Elisha and he could be healed of his leprosy. Beginning at verse 5, the king of Syria, who has been Hadad, he sends Naaman to the king of Israel, who is Jehoram. He was a wicked king in Israel. So beginning at verse 5, so the king of Syria said, go, Naaman, you need to go, and I'll send a letter along, and we'll send some money along, that we might appease the king and we might pay for some things. We'll send 10,000 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And so he came and he brought this letter to the king of Israel. And so it happened that at verse 7, that when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and he said, am I God to kill and to make alive, that he should send this man to heal him of his leprosy? And therefore, please consider how he seeks a quarrel with me. We'll talk about his misunderstanding of the request, but the king of Israel said, who am I? Why did he come to me? I can't heal. I can't give life. Why did he come to me? He fails in a number of things that we'll get to in just a moment. Now, beginning at verse 8, Naaman was told by Elisha to go dip 7 times, and that he did, and he was healed. Elisha heard about this thing before the king, so he tells the king, why did you tear your clothes, at verse 8? Send him to me, and he'll know then there's a prophet in Israel. And so Naaman went to the house of Elisha. Elisha didn't even go out to him. He sent a messenger out saying, go dip 7 times in the river of Jordan, you'll be cleansed of your leprosy. Naaman was greatly disappointed. He said, I thought to myself that he would come out and do some great thing. He said that he would call upon the name of the Lord and wave his hand over me and heal my leprosy. And are not the Abana and the Pharpar rivers better than all the rivers of Damascus? Why the river of Jordan? And could I not wash in them and be clean? So he went away in a rage. And so his servant spoke to him saying, well, if he told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more if he tells you to go wash and be clean, why don't you do that? And so verse 14 said that's exactly what he did, and he came back clean as a child. And so he was cleansed of his leprosy. Now beginning at verse 15, Naaman became convinced of God, and he offered gifts to Elisha. He became convinced that there is no God on the earth except the God of Israel. Therefore, take a gift from your servant. Elisha, in essence, and I'm paraphrasing, said, I don't want your money. I don't want anything. I don't want a gift from you. I'm not going to accept it. Naaman insisted, and he still said, no, I'm not going to accept it. I don't want your money. I don't want anything. We're not wanting anything from you. So Naaman, notice at verse 17, said, well, let me have 2 mule loads of earth. What's he wanting with that? Well, maybe to build an altar to the one true living God. or it may be to scatter it over the ground so that he makes the ground where he's going back among the heathens hallowed ground. Whatever the case, he wants 2 mule loads of earth. And in verse 18 he's saying, and I might paraphrase again, I'm going to be going into the temple of my gods, but when I go into the temple of my gods, I will not be worshiping those gods. I will be honoring the God of heaven, the one true God who's healed me. That's what I will be doing. So now beginning at verse 20, Gehazi. Who is Gehazi? He is a servant of Elisha. He's a man that has spent time with Elisha. He's a man that hears the revelation from Elisha, seen the miracles of Elisha, knows that Elisha is a man of God. He sins and he ends up with leprosy. What did he do? He takes out after Naaman now, after Naaman leaves, and runs to Naaman and he says, and he lies to him and he said, well, my master has sent me. In other words, Elisha has sent me. And there's been some men of the prophet, the sons of the prophets, who came and they need some money and they need a change of clothes. And so could you give us some of what you offered? And he said he would, and he did. Elisha found out about that. I want you to notice beginning at verse 25. And he said, where'd you go? And he said, I hadn't been anywhere. You lied again. Elisha said, yeah, you have. You've been somewhere, and you went to Naaman, and you got some money from him. You got the change of clothes from him. And he told him that wasn't right. And we'll talk about verse 26, a little controversial verse a little bit later. And verse 27 ends the chapter by him simply saying, the leprosy that Naaman had, you will now have, and he did. And that's the story of chapter 5. What I want you to notice is there are 6 people in this. There's more, but there's 6 I want us to pay attention to. There, first of all, is Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army, who was a leper. There's a slave girl. We don't know her name, but she was a young girl from Israel. And she is a servant to Naaman's wife. And that's about all we know about her. We'll talk about her in a little bit. Then there is the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad. We read about Ben-Hadad a number of places. And so he's briefly mentioned here, and he doesn't play a major role, but he's here in this context. Then there's also another king of Israel here, and that's Jehoram. He's a wicked king. Doesn't seem to have much faith in God. And then there is the prophet Elisha, a man of God, who tells him, you go dip 7 times in the river Jordan, you'll be cleansed of your leprosy. Then there's Gehazi, who is a servant of Elisha. So we'll be talking about these 6 people. So I want to talk tonight about 6 people and 6 lessons. It's a story of trust. The trust that this girl had, the trust that Naaman had, the trust that Elisha has, the lack of trust that Gehazi had. This is a story of trust. 6 people and 6 lessons from the healing of Naaman. Let's begin with this. I want us to focus on the need of a notable man. The need of a notable man. Let's start with Naaman. Naaman was an important and notable man, verse 1 says. He was a commander of the Syrian army. That makes him a very important man. In other words, he's kind of the right-hand man of the king. He is a commander of the Syrian army. Verse 1 says that he was great and honorable in the eyes of his king. That is, his own master viewed him as a great and honorable man. Quite often a king may look at some of his commanders as being practically worthless, but not this king. Ben-Hadad looks at Naaman and views him as a great and as an honorable man. But furthermore, verse 1 said he was a successful warrior. Look at the end of verse 1, that he was a mighty man. In fact, verse 1 said God had given him victory, which tells us that God sometimes uses the heathen to accomplish his purpose, and God had given victory to Syria. And so victory had come because of the hand of God. But nonetheless, verse 1 says that he was a mighty man of valor. In other words, he was a successful warrior. He's a mighty man. He's an important man. But I want you to notice that he had a serious problem. Verse 1 said, but he was a leper. Now, leprosy was a serious problem. Leprosy was a slow progressing skin disease, the ISBE says, that often came with scabs and white spots deeper than the skins, and quite often and sometimes it came with the idea of raw flesh. Indeed, a terrible, terrible problem. And what I'm learning from this context, that being important, being notable, being powerful, didn't exempt him from the very same problem that the lowliest person in his outfit or the lowliest soldier might have had. He might have had a low soldier that was the lowest man on the totem pole that had the problem. And here is Naaman, the highest at the totem pole, except for the king. He has the same problem that everyone else has. He had a problem for which he couldn't find a cure. Evidence of that would be at verse 3, where the slave girl is involved in some conversation with Naaman's wife, and Naaman is mulling over, what can I do about that? Because the slave girl is the one who makes a suggestion. We'll come back to her suggestion here in just a moment. So he has a problem for which he cannot find a cure. Now there's a parallel with sin in this context. And what I mean by that, it matters little who we are or what we accomplish. We all have the same problem. And the problem is sin. Let's notice in Romans 5 and in verse 12, death passed upon all men because all have sinned. And so this separation from God, that problem of being separated from God, passes upon everybody. We have the same problem because of sin, because we violated the will of God. Naaman had the same problem that the lowliest private had in his army. And so here is a notable man, the need of a notable man. But I want to shift now and talk about the influence of an uninfluential person. The influence of an uninfluential person. And that's the young slave girl. Now she's quite interesting in this context. Beginning at verse 3. Verse 2 said that they had gone out on raids and they had taken captive a young girl from the land of Israel. And so here's a young girl that had been taken captive from the land of Israel. Now she was young. I don't know how young, the text doesn't tell us. Quite often people refer to her in comments, the little maiden. I don't know how little she was. I don't know how young she was. But being young, she must have had very little influence. It's not like she wielded a lot of influence and power in Syria. I want to suggest to you also she was a slave. She was a servant. Servants don't often carry much weight and influence. And so she's a servant in the household of Naaman. That wouldn't carry a lot of weight and a lot of influence. She's young. She's a servant. And let's add to the fact she's in enemy territory. Surely her word doesn't carry a lot of weight. And so here is a slave in enemy territory. She's young. She's a girl. And what influence does she carry in that society? She's an uninfluential person. One writer said, it seems like a rather obscure source to be the key of Naaman's healing. Naaman has a great problem. Perhaps he had looked to some of the mighty men around. What can I do to be healed of my leprosy? He has found no cure. And then here seems to be the most obscure source for finding a cure for his leprosy. A little slave girl from Israel. She's young, uninfluential. But I want you to see this contrast between the slave girl and Naaman to emphasize that she seemed to be such little influence in that society. You see, she was an Israelite, and they're in Syria now, and he's a Syrian. She was a little maiden, and he was great and honorable. She was a captive servant. He's the commander of the army. She has no fame at all. She's not known to the king. He's known to the king. In fact, he has fame with the king. He holds him as a great and an honorable man. This girl doesn't hardly have any influence at all. But as it turned out, she ended up being the little cog that turned the big wheel. Let's go back to our context. Look at verse 2 and verse 3. She remembers what she had seen and what she had been taught. Here was this little girl. She was taken from the land of Israel. Look at verse 3. She said to her mistress, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. Notice she doesn't say, if he would go and maybe find somebody over in Israel, some prophet somewhere. She was talking about a particular prophet, the prophet Elisha. She remembers what she had seen, and she remembers what she's been taught from that of a little child. She knew something about the prophets of God. She knew something about Elisha and what he was capable of doing. I want you to notice in verse 3, she had faith in what the prophet could do. Notice again at verse 3, she said that he would heal him of his leprosy. Let him go find. If he would just go to the land of Israel and go to Samaria and find that prophet Elisha, he will heal him of his leprosy. I want you to notice she cared about her master, even though she had been being held as a slave against her will. I don't know about you, but I might have felt like somebody holding me as a slave against my will, and they have leprosy. Let them have leprosy and let them die. Could care less about them, but not this little girl. She cared about her master. Now I want you to drop down to verse 7. Remember the king Jehoram, when he got this letter from the king Ben-Hadad, when he gets the letter, his reaction was, who am I that I should kill or that I should heal or give life? What could I do about that? What I want you to see is that she had stronger faith than the leader, the king. When she sees a man with leprosy, she said, if he could just find that prophet over there, maybe that prophet could heal him, or he would heal him. Not maybe, but he would heal him. And here's a king that doesn't say a thing about that. As the Bible Knowledge Commentary suggested later, the slave girl's faith in the Lord may have been an indirect rebuke of the Israel's king Jehoram, who had no faith in God. It does seem to be a rebuke of the king, who doesn't have faith, who doesn't have the same thing, and we'll talk about his failure in a moment. But let's talk about what she did, this young girl. She indeed is that little cog that turned the big wheel. She didn't make any claims about what she could do. She doesn't go to her mistress and say to her that if you would let me talk to your master, if you would let me talk to Naaman, I have the answer, I think I can heal him. She doesn't do that at all. She merely told her mistress about what Elisha could do. Now, well, that's interesting because, let's go to Luke chapter 4 and verse 27. She had never seen this before. You say, well, maybe she's seen Elisha. I bet she had seen a case and had heard of cases where Elisha had healed leprosy and healed leprosy and healed leprosy and healed it again, but that had never been done before. Let's go to Luke chapter 4 and verse 27. There were many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha. That's where we're talking of. But none of them were cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. Isn't that interesting? She's saying to her mistress, if Naaman would go over there to Elisha, he would heal him of his leprosy. But Elisha has never done that before. She's never heard about that before. She thinks Elisha can do that because of other miracles. So now take note of this. From the other miracles, she had to draw that conclusion. She had no other evidence than that. Here's a man that's from God. He's worked miracle after miracle after miracle. Has he ever healed a leper? No, I hadn't seen that. But I know he can heal him, though. How do you know that? Because of the other miracles he's done. She drew that conclusion. That was a necessary inference she drew. I know it can happen. She didn't say, I think maybe it's worth a try. She said, he can heal him of this. And so she recommends him. All she did, look at verse 3, was merely point Naaman's wife in the right direction. No indication that she actually talked to Naaman. She just talks to Naaman's wife and said, that's where he needs to go. That's the person they need to talk to. There's the one that has the answer. If he'd just go there, that's where the answer will be found. That's all she did. She indeed was a little cog that turned the big wheel. And what I'm here to suggest to you is this, that you may be that uninfluential person that can point someone in the right direction. You may think, you know what, I'm a nobody. I don't have any power. I don't have much influence. I'm young. Or I'm old, and I don't have a lot of influence. I don't wield a lot of influence. People are not turning to me for advice. No one was turning to her for advice. She volunteered some information and pointed Naaman's wife in the right direction. You may be that uninfluential person that can point someone in the right direction like this little girl. Here's a third person we want to talk about, and that's the failure of a powerful leader. We saw the need of a notable man. We saw the influence of an uninfluential person. Let's talk about the failure of a powerful leader. And that's King Jehoram. The leader is King Jehoram, the son of Ahab. Chapter 3, verse 1 identifies the king that we're talking about. Indeed, he is a powerful person. He is a powerful leader. Now, I want you to notice at verse 7 the reaction of the king. The king of Syria sends a letter, and he said, now be advised, I'm reading at verse 6, that when this letter comes, that I have sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. And that's what the letter said. I'm sending him to you that you may heal him of his leprosy. And what was his reaction? His reaction, first of all, verse 7 was he tore his clothes in anxiety and distress. In other words, he was very bothered and disturbed at this letter. What in the world is this letter about? Why is the king of Syria sending me this letter and sending me this man? Secondly, he assumed that this was an expectation for him to do the healing. Naaman knew that there was a prophet over there. Whether Ben-Hadad understood that, I'm not sure. But somewhere in this communication, at least Naaman is there. He can identify that we're looking actually for a prophet this little girl told us about. But the king of Syria, as king of Israel, is assuming I'm the one that's expected to do some great thing and I can't do it and I know I can't. Here's something else he assumed according to verse 7. He assumed that this was an effort to start a war. He's trying to start a quarrel with me is what he's doing. I don't know what this trick is. But he sent a man over here and said, I need to heal him. He's trying to start something with me. He made a great failure. Now, I want to talk about wherein he failed. Well, there's a lot of assumption going on. That's one thing, but that's not what I'm interested in. He didn't have the same faith in his God as this little girl. He's supposed to be the king in Israel, the people of God. This little girl over here is saying, there's prophets over there. There's one particular prophet I know can heal him if you just find that prophet. Her confidence was not so much in the prophet, it was in her God. He doesn't have the same faith in his God as the little girl. He didn't even seem to think of Elisha. And you said, well, he probably didn't know Elisha. Elisha knew him well enough that Elisha went to the king and said, well, send him over here to me. They didn't know one another. Yeah, they knew one another. He should have thought about Elisha. The little girl did. But the king didn't even seem to think about Elisha. Who am I to heal this man? What can I do with him? He didn't even think about Elisha. Didn't even cross his mind. And I want to suggest to you there are often those who should be leaders that often fail with a lack of confidence in God and in his word. This king did. There are those who are supposed to be leaders that often fail because the word of God never occurs to them. There's aspects of the revelation of God that didn't even cross their mind. That may be true concerning parents, elders and preachers and friends who are supposed to be leaders. And what we should have thought about, it doesn't even cross our mind. He should have been thinking about Elisha. Didn't even cross his mind. Here we have the failure of a powerful leader. Fourth, let's talk about the simplicity of a spokesman from God. That's Elisha. I want you to notice at verse 10 of our text, the emphasis was on his message. He was a spokesman from God. Now notice what he said. He said, first of all, to the king, send him over here to me. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he must have said something like, I hear there was a man came to you from Syria wanting to be healed of leprosy. Send him over to me. I'll take care of that. I'll heal him. And then he'll know there's a prophet from God. He's interested in the fact that he is a prophet of God. And I want you to notice at verse 10, his emphasis was on his message. You say, how so? Well, notice at verse 10 that Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, he didn't even go out to see Naaman. His focus was not on the importance of Naaman. I don't know if this is a good parallel or not, but imagine if some celebrity, some well-known celebrity, were to come to your house and ask you about the gospel, and rather than go out and then have to talk with them about them being a celebrity and you're glad to meet them and you've heard of their fame, you just send a messenger out and tell them, here's what the gospel is. Well, the celebrity would be greatly disappointed that you didn't even acknowledge who they were. And Naaman must have been disappointed. He didn't even come out. His focus is not on the importance of Naaman. His emphasis is on the message. I'll tell you something else that wasn't emphasized, and that is his focus was not on Elisha himself. He didn't come out and say, now, Naaman, it doesn't really matter who you are, but I want to tell you, I am a prophet of God. I want you to notice all the miracles I've done. He didn't even focus on that. His focus was not on Elisha, on himself, and it wasn't on Naaman. He sent a messenger, and the messenger said, the man of God said, go dip 7 times in the river of Jordan. Be cleansed of your leprosy. That's what you need to hear. Here's the simple message. Now, the message was simple. Let's go back to verse 10. We're focusing upon the simplicity of the spokesman from God. The message was not complicated. It wasn't the kind of thing that Naaman said, well, I've got to think about this. I don't really understand what you mean. He just said, go dip 7 times in the river of Jordan and be cleansed of your leprosy. I want you to notice furthermore that the simplicity didn't fit his human reasoning. Let's go to verse 11 now. At verse 11, he said, he was furious. He's upset. He thought Elisha would come out and do something and wave his hand over him and heal him of his... I thought he would come out and perform some kind of scene of doing something for me. He didn't even come out of his house. I don't understand. He thought Elisha himself would do something big. It didn't fit his way of thinking. Furthermore, don't you notice verse 12? His thought process was that if rivers work, there's better rivers than the river of Jordan. The river of Jordan is quite a muddy river. And if rivers work, if that's the idea, I don't think Jordan's the best river. The Abana and the Pharpar rivers are better than all the rivers of Damascus. So it didn't fit his human reasoning. Let's use some human reasoning now, and this doesn't make sense. Shouldn't he do something different? And if we have to have rivers, let's use another river. Didn't fit his human reasoning. So his reaction, look at verse 11. He was furious. Verse 12 said he went away in a rage. He was mad. He was furious. He's angry. He's saying things derogatory about Elisha because it didn't fit what he thought he ought to get. That was his reaction. Now I want you to notice at verse 13, his servants had more sense than he did. And so they began to reason with him. Let's look at verse 13. His servants came to him and spoke to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more when he says to you, wash and be clean?" In other words, if he'd have told you to do something great and complicated, had 7 steps to it, 10 steps, and you had to figure out what the meaning was, and it had a rhyme and it had a riddle to it, and you had to figure some hidden message out. If he told you to do some great difficult thing, would you have done it? Well, the answer is yeah, I would have done that because I'm a great king, I'm a great warrior. What if he'd have told you to go out and kill 100 men? Could you have done that? Well, yeah, I could have done that. Well, if you've done the great thing, why not just do the simple thing of just going and washing 7 times? Just something simple. So notice verse 14, when he did that, he came back clean as a baby. So notice verse 14, when he went and dipped 7 times in Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, his flesh became like a little child and he was clean. Here's what I'm learning from that. The Lord's plan is simple. Why not just do that? Sometimes the plan on the home and the family is just quite simple. Why not just follow that? The plan for worship is simple. Why not just do that? The plan to be saved is simple. Why not just do that? The plan to get along with others is quite simple. Why not just follow that instead of something complicated? Here we have the simplicity of a spokesman from God. Number 5. Let's focus on the gratefulness of a cleansed man. The gratefulness of a cleansed man. Notice at verse 15 that Naaman returned to Elisha. Then he returned to the man of God. He and all his aides came and stood before him and said, "Indeed, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now, therefore, please take this gift from your servant." Well, what I want you to notice is that Elisha returned with a grateful heart. In other words, he didn't go dipping 7 times in the river of Jordan and say, "You know what, I'm clean, let's go back home. I don't care about that man of God. I don't care about Elisha." He came back to Elisha with a grateful heart, unlike the 9 of the 10 lepers. Remember when Jesus healed the 10 lepers and only 1 came back and Jesus said, "Where are the 9 who were ungrateful?" Here's a man who came back with gratitude because he was cleansed. Notice that he acknowledged the source of his cleansing, verse 15. He doesn't say, "Well, you know what, now I know you are an incredible smart man, Elisha." He looked beyond the spokesman and focuses on the God. Now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. There's the source of my cleansing. So in verses 15 and 16, what did he do? He offered money. The king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, had sent money along and changes of clothes. Why don't you take that to this king or to this prophet? Wherever you're going, you take all of this. And so at the end of verse 15, he said, "Take a gift from your servant." Now notice at verse 16 that he said, "As the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will receive nothing." I'm not interested in your gifts. I'm not in this for money. I'm not wanting to take money from you, Naaman. What I want to do is tell you the revelation of God. I want you to know there's a God in Israel. That's what I want you to know. And he said, "No, I'm not going to accept it." Let me ask you this question. How grateful are we Do we, like Naaman, come running back to the source? Are we grateful for our cleansing? Are we grateful to God who did it? Are we grateful to anyone who helps us along the way? Someone who points us in the right direction and said, that's the way you need to go. Here's where you need to find the answer. But one more time, let's go back to our text. Let's talk about the dishonesty of an untrue servant. Let's talk about Gehazi. Now, verse 20 identifies him as a servant of Elisha, which tells me that Gehazi should have known what was right. So how do you know? Because he was a servant of Elisha. He had seen the miracles. He had heard the revelation from God. He had seen the evidence this man is from God. And there's the miracle of seeing Naaman cleansed. And when Elisha, a spokesman from God, refuses the money, that should have been accepted by Gehazi. But that wasn't the case at all. Let's talk about what he did. He greedily sought gain, beginning at verse 20. What did he do? Well, notice beginning at verse 20, he said, look, my master has spared Naaman the Syrian while not receiving from his hands what he brought. In other words, he took note. He brought a good bit of money with him. He brought silver and gold, and he brought changes of garments, and he brought a lot of good goods with him. And my master just let that get away. And so what did he do? He greedily sought the gain, and I want you to know he lied in the process. He said, I'm going to go get that. I'm going to go get some of that. He's thinking of himself. So at verse 22, he said, when he comes to Naaman, Naaman says, is everything well? And he said, well, all is well, but my master, that is Elisha, sent me. Elisha never sent him. He's lying. And he said, indeed, now 2 young men of the sons of the prophets have come from the mountains of Ephraim. Now give me talents of silver and 2 changes of garments. He said, we need that for them. See, after you left, there's these young prophets came in, and they have some needs, and we want to supply their needs. And my master sent me to come and get that. He said, well, yeah, take that. Well, notice now at verse 25, that when he comes back, Gehazi comes back, and Elisha asked him, he said, where did you go, Gehazi? And he said, your servant did not go anywhere. He lied again. He's greedily seeking after gain, taking what's not rightfully his, and then he's lying twice in the process. Said, I didn't go anywhere. I want you to notice the damage that was done now at verse 26. Here's what Elisha says to him. He said, this is the more difficult verse of the whole context. He said, did not my heart go with you when you turned back from his chariot to meet you? When he turned back from his chariot to meet you? Now, you may be reading a translation that said, did not my, something along the line, instead of my heart, the one of my heart, or it gives the impression that he's talking about one who is of their heart. So there's 2 possibilities here, perhaps more. He may be saying that did not the one that's a favored servant of mine, that is you, Gehazi, did you not go after him? That may be what he's saying, but I think it's more that he's saying, did not my spirit go with you? In other words, I wasn't there, but I know what you did. That's what he's saying. That I wasn't there with you, but my spirit, not my approval, but I was there in spirit in the sense, I know what you did. I saw what you did. I understand what you did. And then notice he said, this was not the time. We'll come back to that in just a second. But notice he said, is it time to receive money and to receive clothing and olive trees and vineyards and sheep and oxen and male and female servants? In other words, the point is, it's not time for the prophet of God to take money from the non-Israelite. It's not time for that. That's not the place for that. So here's what I want you to see. You see, they had just impressed the heathen with their unselfish nature of their religion. Elisha had just healed him of his leprosy, giving him the revelation of God. He's offered money. I'm not interested in money. I don't want your money. But Gehazi goes running after him to get the money. Now Gehazi manifests his greed. He leaves the wrong impression with Naaman. In verse 26, what Elisha is saying, this was not the time for that. This was not the place for that. There may be time to get money, but this was not the place for that. Could you imagine someone coming, non-Christian, coming into the assembly, and they ask for Bible information, and we give them Bible lessons and teach them something, and they say, let me give you lots of money for this. And we say, no, 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 no. And then one of the members goes running out in the parking lot. Well, we'll take just a little bit. We'll take just a little of what you have. The damage that's done. That's what Gehazi did in this context. Now notice verse 27, he suffers because of it. Not only did the cause of the Lord, the reputation of God's people suffer, but he himself suffered because of a dishonesty. The leprosy that had been received by Naaman is now upon him. You want what Naaman had? You want his money? Well, you got his money, but I'll tell you what else you're going to get. You're going to get his leprosy. You're going to get that too. And that he did, and that's how the story ends. It is not uncommon for a servant of God to turn away from God, while at the same time the least likely person points others toward obedience. You see, Gehazi had the greatest opportunity compared to the little slave girl to be of influence. And he's turned away from the Lord, while this little girl who seems to have little influence at all is the very one that points someone toward obedience. That's not uncommon. So what have we seen? 6 people and 6 lessons. There was the need of a notable man, the influence of an uninfluential person, the failure of a powerful leader, the simplicity of a spokesman from God, the gratefulness of a cleansed man, and the dishonesty of an untrue servant. Hopefully that story helps you, helps me, helps us all as we try to serve our God. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you become one tonight? The plan of God is simple, like dipping 7 times in the river of Jordan. Would you not believe, repent, and confess and be baptized? How hard is that? If God required some difficult, hard thing, would you do it? And you say, well, yeah, I'd do that. Why not do the simple? Why not just do the simple of repenting and being baptized? If you're subject in any way, would you come all together? We stand and while we sing.